Well, hello and welcome to our video on HTML5 forms. I'm Scott McLeod and I will guide you through the creation of an HTML form using some of the latest features of HTML, which give us some additional capabilities. So let's get right to it. We have a starting point, and it looks like this is a folder called HTML forms, and inside of it we have two images, two web pages, and two style sheets. And we're focusing in on this page called feedback. Later we'll see the relevance of the response page, and one of these images is on each of those HTML pages, and the style sheets will come into play as we start to work with the files more and are concerned a little bit with the style of them at the end. So first of all, let's launch the starting feedback page. So let's just open that up and we'll see that we have some basic page components there, but there really isn't any form, and that's really our job here in this tutorial video, to develop the form that would go right in this area here below the introductory paragraph and above the copyright area. So let's now open this document in brackets, which will be our editor for this video, and start to build that form piece by piece. We'll start with it as simply as possible, and then we'll build some additional capabilities into it to make it a little bit more practical and take advantage of some of those latest HTML5 capabilities. So now to brackets. Now, when you work with brackets and you're working with some files already in an existing folder, it's a good idea to open folder and point brackets to those files. In our case here, it's on the desktop and it's called HTML forms. We select that folder, and now we have immediate access to those files in that folder, and we're just one click away from opening them up and editing them in brackets. So we're going to take a look now at this empty area here just below that introductory paragraph and above that copyright area that we were just looking at a minute ago in the browser, and this is where we're going to start to develop our form. So first things first, before you can build a form, you need form tags to surround it. So we're going to begin with form tags, opening and closing, and we'll put a little space between them, as that's where all of the form elements are going to go, between the opening and closing form tags. Now the form tag itself has some attributes that typically go with it, but again we're trying to keep things simple here and we'll build on it later, so we'll fill out some of those attributes such as action and method later. Of course, we should back up a moment here and just discuss forms in general, what role they play in HTML. They allow users to communicate with the web server so that a company can get information from their customers, whether it's trying to log into an account, whether it's trying to make a transaction, whether you're simply searching for something, and then there's some interaction on the web server side, and then the results typically of that form submission show up back in the browser on the customer side. We here in HTML can't do a lot about the heavy-duty processing that's going to be happening on the server. Our job here in HTML is to design the form so that it can be easily filled out by the user or customer with some level of clarity and possibly some validation in case things are not filled out properly. And then the rest is more of a heavier programming side that we would take up in another class. All right, with that all in mind, then let's get going. We would like to develop a little feedback form here for the user to give us some feedback about the website or about their products or something related to the company on this supposed website. Of course, we only have, this page that we're working on almost in isolation here, but the assumption is there's a bigger website that the customer has been visiting and now comes to this page. So with all that in mind, we're going to be asking them to possibly fill in their name. We want to know possibly how to contact them back, maybe through an email or through a phone call or text. We want to know their feedback comments, what that feedback is regarding, and then of course we need to give them an opportunity to submit that form. All right, so we're going to begin with an area to allow the customer to add their comments. They're going to be placed inside a paragraph, and then we need to prompt them to let them know what is supposed to be entered there. Next, we need the actual form element that's going to allow the customer to enter their comments, and that's going to be a text area tag, open and close. Normally we'd have some attributes to add to that text area opening tag, but for now we'll leave it empty. Next, in the paragraph below, we will try to allow the user to indicate what their comments are regarding. Is it about the products? Is it about some customer service, the website itself, shipping, or something else? So we're going to next put a separate paragraph. So we'll say your feedback is regarding as the prompt, and then we're going to give them a set of choices to indicate that feedback. We're going to do that with a select tag. Now the select tag comes with some options. It's like a drop-down list. So we put some space between the open and closing select tags, and we begin the process here of adding options. And each option allows us to indicate one choice. Now you could copy and paste that, thereby getting multiple options without having to do much typing, except for change the products to whatever else you might want. We're going to use a capital P on the item inside. Customer service will be the second one. Third one will be website. Shipping. And the last one will just going to be a generic other, in case we didn't guess at what the particular comments were about. What we're going to do now is save, and we're going to take a look at this in the browser. So here you see the results of our initial form work. So here's a place for the user or customer to give positive or negative feedback of their choosing. You can see that by default it's not a very big area to type into, but if you go too far, you can see that we automatically get a scroll bar. So there's some browser intelligence built into this text area. And here are the choices that we gave. Each of these option tags ends up being one of the drop-down choices. Now, you notice that products is the default choice. I'm not a big fan of that because if the user doesn't choose anything, it looks like they chose products. So we're going to come up with a solution to that back in the editor. That solution would be to give an additional option at the beginning that just says choose one. And that way they know that that's what they're supposed to do. And if they don't, it's communicated as choose one instead of products. So we know that they just didn't bother to fill it out. And so we might want to, at this point, beautify. If you have that extension set up in brackets, it's just a nice way of keeping things organized and looking nice within your code. All right, we're going to continue now with some further form elements that allow some contact information to be given by the user. First, we'll ask them for their name. We'll start a new paragraph. We'll prompt them, and then we'll have an input tag, which we're going to identify as one of many types. This is a very important and necessary attribute for the input tag because the browser has many different types of elements it can build from an input, and we need to tell it which one we're interested in having. This is going to be a text box, so it'll just be a text type, and then the browser knows what kind of input to expect, and it will build the proper interface for it, and that's going to be the end of the input tag there. Next, we're going to ask the customer how to contact them. That could be through a text, through an email, or through a phone call. So we're going to say in a new paragraph, how can we contact you? And we'll say check all that apply because they may have multiple ways in which they would like to be contacted potentially. We're going to create a space between this line and the next. Not necessarily a break in the code here, but a break on the web page itself. So we're going to now have checkboxes. We'll use an input with type equal, guess what, checkbox. And that will be the checkbox for wanting us to call them. Next, another input, also a checkbox. This second one will be for texting. And a third one now, and last one, for email. Again, type equal checkbox. And lastly, email. question mark. All right, so that's where they're going to be indicating which form of communication they might want. And then, of course, we won't be able to call or email them unless they give us that information. So we need to give them a space for that. And those will be in text boxes, for now at least. So here's where they can fill in their phone if they chose that mode of communication. That'll be an input tag. You can see how important those input tags are. And this will be text for now. And then, lastly here, another paragraph for email. Now let's take a look after saving. Take a look at the result of that. And you can see quite a lot more has developed on the web page since last time. Comments are still there. Choose one, and here are the new elements. A place for them to put their name. This is a text box. We have the 3 check boxes for calling, texting, and or emailing. And we have a place for their phone and a place for their email. You may have noticed that we don't have a place for them to submit, and that's a critical thing that we need to have. So we're going to add that as our last piece of this form element puzzle. Let's go back now to brackets to add that. So below our email paragraph, we'll have one final paragraph, and that will be the submit button. And guess what? Submit buttons are also inputs. The type on those is submit. And let's see what that looks like. So here we get a submit button, so that after filling some information out here and making some choices, some of which we can fill out, some of which we can leave blank, when we submit, what happens now? We click that submit button. This seems like it clears out the form elements that were filled out and doesn't do much of anything else. That's the case at the moment because we don't have the form tag filled out with an action that would take it to the server and process that information. So again, so far our focus is primarily here on the design side to get these form elements looking and acting right in the browser for the customer. So back now into brackets to focus some more attention on these various form elements. Okay, next we're going to start adding some of those enhancements so that our form acts in a more practical manner. So we're going to begin at the top of our form, work our way down. The text area I felt was too small to really encourage good feedback. So we're going to add a couple of attributes to that text area. One is rows, one is columns, and those are going to increase the size appropriately of our text area and allow the user more space. These numbers I'm throwing in there, 3 rows and 40 columns, are pretty much just up to whatever you think is appropriate in your particular design and in your needs for communication. That's 3 rows means 3 lines of text. Of course, we'll still get the scroll bar after that, but it encourages a little bit more feedback to see that being a bigger text area. All right, and now it would help if we had IDs and names given to these. It's really required to have a name in order for the server to be able to recognize what piece of information this is coming to it. So we're going to create comments as our name. So that means that if someone fills in great website as the comment, when it hits the server after submitting, it'll say comments equal great website. So each of our form elements is going to be given a name, and we're going to be labeling and needing an ID for each as well, and it makes good sense to just keep the ID and the name the same. Now they're going to serve different purposes. The name again associates with the value when it gets sent to the server, and the ID is more for what's going on in the browser. It helps to identify it in a more local sense and may also help in styling. So we'll just routinely give a name and an ID to each one of these, and the name will be based on what the information is holding. All right, so let's move on to the next one, which is the select. Now the select is also going to need communicate its value. So we're going to do name equals, and we'll just do because it's regarding. Keep it short here. The ID will also be That takes care of the select. And also the option. We're going to be communicating information to the server through these option values. So whichever one is selected, we can set the value that's being communicated, and it can be different from what was shown to the user. So for example, for choose one, the value might be none, meaning the user didn't make a choice, so we'll communicate none to the server rather than choose one, which is presented to the customer. So we're going to put a value in each one of these. Now for products, it just makes sense for key products probably. For customer service, for example, you could abbreviate that if that made sense to your website, for example. Value equals site. Value equals shipping, and value equals other. So there's the values for all of the options within the select. So for example, if they were to choose website, then it will end up being communicated to the server as equals site, and we'll know what that means on the other end. All right, let's continue moving down. Next, we're going to be filling in IDs and names for each of these form elements. So in the input here, and we'll put these after the type. The type is such an important attribute that I'm going to leave that first, and we'll put the ID and the name after that. There really is no order required on those attributes, but I try to do them in what I think is the most important order. So we're going to call this name. We're asking them for their name, so that maybe makes sense. So name equals, a little strange, but name equals name, and then ID equals name also. Keep in mind that we need a space between our attributes, but no spaces around the equal signs, and the values of the attributes always need to be in quotes. So that takes care of the input for name. We also have an input here for each of the three checkboxes. So we do need to have an ID on each one of those. So the ID on the first one has to do with the call. So name equals call, ID equals call. Then for the one with text, name equals text, ID equals text. And lastly, for the one for the email, name equals email, ID equals email. And we are now down to the last couple of elements. We have phone and email text boxes. And now we have to be a little bit careful here because we cannot repeat IDs and names. So this is going to be phone num because it is the actual phone number. And this is going to be name equals email addy, as in the actual address. ID equals email addy. So that's just to make them unique from the checkboxes that were similarly named. And we don't have to worry at the moment here about the submit button having an ID and a name, but we could, just to see another attribute that's useful, you can give a value to a submit button, and that will be used then as the actual text on the button. So rather than submit, we could say send feedback, for example. It just clarifies to the user what pushing that button is going to mean. All right, now let's save all of these changes. And let's take another look at the browser, how it renders our page. Okay, so we can see that we have a much bigger comment area, and you can see that we do in fact have 3 lines or rows to work with, and everything else should pretty much just behave as it did before. So no big changes here except the send feedback. So the only things we can really see from our coding changes are these two. But keep in mind, we now have a feedback page that acts much better in terms of communicating to the server, and we'll see that shortly. So for now, again back to brackets, And what we want to do here now next is add some labels. Now, what the labels are going to do is to help the accessibility of the page for people who may not be able to work with it as easy as others. Perhaps give it a little bit more style capabilities. It does add a little bit of complexity to the code, but it does make the page more accessible, easier to work with, and is definitely recommended. So we're going to go up to the top where our comments are, and what we're going to do is we're going to put a label tag right before our prompt, and then we're going to carefully move that closing label to be after the prompt, like so. Now, and then inside the opening label tag, we're going to use an attribute called for. And for is going to allow us to identify the ID of the actual form element that goes with it, in this case, comments. So what this is saying is this is the label that goes with this. Now that's pretty obvious to the user because it's sitting right in front of it on the web page, but the browser doesn't necessarily know that. It just sees some text nearby. It doesn't know for sure that that's the actual label for it. But with this technique of putting the label around your prompt and putting the for with an ID that matches the unique ID of that form element, it makes it absolutely crystal clear, and then the browser can act on that clarity by making the page function better, and we'll see that later. So let's continue now to do that for our other form elements. So for the select, we are going to be able to put a label here in front of your feedback is regarding. We're going to take that closing label, cut it out of there, paste it into there, and then likewise put a for equals re. Why re? Because that's the name of our select. Now you'll be happy to know that we don't need to put labels on each of these options. It's just on the main item surrounding it, the select itself. All right, so we're moving down now into the name text box next. We're going to create a label around name colon. And we'll repeat this rather mechanical process now of surrounding the prompt with the label and adding the for that matches the previously created ID. In this case, the ID is name, and we're good to go there. Okay, next we're going to be adding labels for those three checkboxes. We don't need one around the how can we contact you prompt because that's a general one, and we instead need them around the checkbox areas themselves. So one for each of these checkboxes. There's the prompt. The prompt in the case of a checkbox is typically put after the checkbox. So that's why we're seeing the input first and then the prompt second. So our label is going to go actually after the input, unlike the previous ones. And we'll move that closing label to after the question mark for the call. We will then add the for equals the ID, and we have to go to the previous checkbox ID, call in this case, to know what ID we're matching up with. Now we move on to the one for text, add a label there, and I'll go ahead and put the for in there ahead of time, and that's going to be text, and then close off that label, and we can move the closing tag. Lastly, we need a label for email, and that's going to be for email. Close off that label and move the closing tag. Here you go. You need to pay a little bit of attention sometimes to the spacing around it. So for example, I have no spaces around call. The implication is that the label area is a clickable area that will help users to get to the actual element. So it's not a bad idea really to have the spacing inside to give a little more space to click. So if we were to take that approach, we just want to be consistent with having a space on either side of the actual prompt in each case. Just a good idea to keep in mind and be consistent with it. All right, now we're down to phone and email inputs. For those, we're going to have labels, and we're going to match the IDs of phone num and email addy for each of these. These again are a little bit easier to work with because the prompt is out in front of the input. Just seems to be a little bit more natural. Label for equals, and the spelling here is critical that you get it right or it won't connect. Your ID and your for need to match, that is. Okay, now we're going to close that off there after phone prompt, And then lastly, the last label at least, will be for our email. Email Addy, that is, with our closing tag being a space away from the prompt. All right, let's save that and see what that looks like in the browser. Now, can we see any difference? Not really, but there is a difference, and that is that you can click on the actual label to activate the element. You can actually check a checkbox just by clicking on its label. You can't do that otherwise. So that's a nice feature. Back to brackets. Now, back in brackets, let's add some functionality to the form tag itself. Now, the form tag, as I mentioned earlier, typically comes with a couple of attributes. One's called action and one's called method, and they perform different tasks. Action is the one that's going to be most obvious to us here, and let's take action equals. And this is where you would specify the script on the server that's going to be processing that form data that we're sending. Now, we can't really do that here in this class because, again, we don't have programming that's part of this course. So we're going to simulate that by choosing an action that's a local page. Remember that we have a second page called response. Let's go take a look at the response page here. If we open that in a browser, it says, "Thank you for your feedback," and so on. And we're going to use that page, response.html, as a way of connecting our submission to that response page. And we do that through that action. So back in brackets, our action will be response.html. It's almost like it's turning the submit button into a link to that page. So let's go ahead and save and see how that changes the interaction in the browser. So if we fill out the form, give a phone number, and send the feedback, see what happens now? Instead of sitting there, it jumps to that other page. So that's pretty cool. Now, the only misleading thing here is that it's thanking us for the feedback and saying that we're going to act on your comments and get in touch with you. And of course, that information is just going into the black hole of form submissions at this point, since we don't have any server processing going on. But we're going through the motions here and seeing how to code up forms properly. Also, you'll notice that you can actually see by default some of the settings that were on the form. This gives you a clue as to the names that you gave to your form elements and how the browser is sending that information to your server. So comments equal great site, equals site, name we didn't fill out, so it's blank, and phone number is given since I did fill it in, email address is blank, and so on. So that's important for action. The second attribute I mentioned is method. And there are two method values. We'll see them in a moment, get and post. The default here is get, and that's what sets up the values being displayed here in the address. Now, that's not the most secure thing in the world, and for most applications, you probably want post. What post will do is not attach the information here, but send it more silently, more securely. And we'll stick with this method of get, but you can use post as well, and in most applications you would. For here, it kind of helps us to see the names, to see that they're set up properly and associated with the correct data. All right, so we've gone a long way, but believe it or not, there's still some further ways to go. What can we still do? For one thing, you may want certain fields to be required and others not required. Also, we would like to make sure that some of this information is filled out properly, and if it's not, give a heads up to the customer rather than have a problem at the server. We'd like to be proactive. So we're going to use some additional capabilities within the form code to promote that. And the easiest of those is the required part. So let's say, for example, that we would want to require their comments. That might make sense. After all, it's a feedback form, so if they're not willing to give us feedback, then it's probably not worth submitting. But you might not want to make their name required. So if you want the comments to be required, you go into the text area, not the label, but the actual element itself. And I'm going to go to the very last attribute to add this one, and it would be called required. As far as HTML5 is concerned, required is all you really need to put in there. But normally for HTML, historically, you would want to put equal and a value, and we'll just put the same value. So it's kind of silly, but it's required equal required. That makes the attribute look more normal. It's not completely needed, but what this is going to do now for our form is make sure that that's entered before the form gets submitted. What else can we do? Let's go down and see if we can enhance the phone and email address entries, because those are a little bit more complicated entries and somebody could accidentally enter them wrong. HTML5 has some additional types, and instead of just a generic text, for a phone number, we can put TEL for telephone. And for an email address, we can put the type of email. So those are going to give us some additional capabilities to allow the browser to do some helpful validation for us. So let's save and let's take a look at those enhancements to our form. Again, we don't see a lot of differences here, but what we will see is when we try to work with the form, if we send feedback before we fill something out, it says, look, please fill out this field. It's required. So once I fill that out, now I can send the form and it'll be fine. All right, now let's take a look at phone and email and see what kind of effects we're getting from those new types that we set up. For an email, if I choose to enter it, but I don't give a proper email address, you can see that's already giving me some feedback about the malformed email address. But let's see what happens if I try to send it. So it says, please include @ in the email address. So now, as I begin to correct that, it's still giving me more information as I type. So that's nice. Now let's take a look at phone. So what if I give it a garbage phone number and then try to submit? It actually accepts it. The problem here is that there's all kinds of different formats for phone numbers. International phone numbers look very different typically from US ones that we're familiar with. So it's really hard for a browser to do a good job on its own of validation. So when we come back to the form, if we want to impose some more specific phone number formatting, we're going to have to get into the code here and be pretty specific with it. That'll be one of the last things we do. We also want to add field sets to kind of organize the form a little more nicely for the user. So let's do the field sets first, and then we'll get into the details of that phone number. We're going to basically break this form down into two major chunks. The first one involves the feedback itself, which are these two, text area and select, and then the rest of the stuff below is more like the contact information. So with that in mind, we're going to go just below the form tag itself, and we're going to create what's called a field set. Field set is just basically a set of form fields, and then we'll give each field set an ID, and that would be for styling more than anything else. We'll call that feedback info, and we'll close the field set. Now the end tag for field set needs to go visually at the end. So that's going to go here, so it surrounds those entries. And I'm going to beautify that, and that allows the field sets to kind of be more visually in your code as well. And then we'll start the next field set right below it. And that one will have an ID of contact info. Close that off, and then this closing field set is going to end up going right below the email address, but above the submit button. Again, we need the help of Beautify. All right, now what's nice about field sets is you get a little bit of a visual in the browser to show the organization. Normally, we also attach a legend to them, and we'll see that in a moment when we come back. Now you can see visually the two areas separated, although because of the lines, it doesn't look all that beautiful. Now keep in mind that we have a style sheet that I can apply to this form to make it look nicer. But before we do that, we're going to add something into these field sets called a legend. And that just gives you ability to give a name to that section that you're putting that border around. Okay, let's put the legend just inside the field set, and we give a name for that legend. Feedback info is what we'll call that one, and then we'll put a similar legend right on the contact info one, and we'll call that contact info. So it's going to be a little bit of a label that's going to be visual in the browser, just to help the user see that organization a little bit more nicely. And there you can see feedback info and contact info. Now, in terms of the looks of this form, it's a little awkward because of the way things are wrapping around this image and things are jammed up a little bit too much. So what we're going to do now to make things look a little better is we're going to go into the head section and we're going to add a link to the second style sheet that I've set up previously to handle the form itself. So we're going to put a link, and the href needs to match the actual style sheet's name. It's called form.css, and you can see it here. And that finishes the style sheet off, and we should now see immediately nicer looking form. So what that style sheet does, it gives a uniform width to the two field sets. It gives a more enhanced look to the legend. It also gives a background, and it separates them vertically more than they were initially. So it's an enhanced look. If you want to study the style sheet to see how it was put together and how those actual properties were set up, you can. But our focus here is on the HTML itself, so we won't bother to do that. Now, the one remaining task we have here is to enhance the phone number validation, because as we saw, there was really no attempt by the browser to help us out with bad phone numbers. So let's go back to the editor for that final piece. And we'll scroll down to that last phone number element. It's the input type equal TL. That's where we need to add some validation. So we're going to move to the end of that after the ID. I want to make it clear what we're adding, so I'm going to put in an enter key there just to allow you to see things more clearly as we type it. Now, what you're allowed to do in any text-oriented field is to add something called a pattern. The pattern attribute allows you to give a specific format that you want that input to be in. Now, the format that you give has to be done in a certain way, and it's a very complicated language that needs to be used. So more or less you're going to type what I type, and you may or may not understand everything I'm typing. But it's going to begin with a /D3. In brackets. Now, careful to use the curly brackets. This means our pattern for our phone number is going to have to start with 3 digits. For us, that's an area code. Next, we want a dash. The way we have to give that is with a square bracket, backwards slash, and then a dash, followed by, guess what, another 3 digits, right? After the area code comes the 3-digit prefix. So, just like the initial one, /D and 3 inside. And guess what comes next? A dash, given in the same way it was initially. So that's square brackets, / dash. And then lastly, 4 digits. So /D, curly brackets, 4. The 4 is the multiplier. So it's 3 digits, dash, 3 digits, dash, 4 digits. And that's how we form a phone number. And lastly, if you're going to have a specific pattern that you're asking the user to use, then you should indicate that to them. And we can do that with some text in the prompt here, or we can use something called a placeholder. So after the pattern, let's add the placeholder. Placeholder is just text, so you can type anything you want in there. And I'm going to say use XXX dash XXX dash XXXX. The pattern, we communicate that to the browser, the customer never sees it. Placeholder is what the browser doesn't care about, but the customer needs to see. So these two work together. Now let's clean up this set of attributes so they're not all over multiple lines. Okay, now let's save and take a look at the result. All right, look at that placeholder. That's a nice feature. And now what happens if we don't give the phone number in that nice manner? Aha, these match the requested format. And when it is typed in properly, it works. So there you have it. We've seen a lot of capabilities that HTML5 gives us to better match form input to our needs and to our customers' needs as well. All right, thank you very much. Hope you learned some things about forms, and we'll see you in the next video.